This is one of the most important joints to master in cabinet making. But why? And perhaps more importantly, how? This is the housed mortise and tenon, or the stub tenon, or the dado with a mortise and tenon in it. You can call it whatever you want, but they're all variations on a flavor. Essentially what this is, at the end of the day, ooh, that's a good tight one. It's just a simple dado and a couple of mortises in there to allow you to put a couple of tenons on your board in order to get deeper into that mortise and create more leverage. That's all it is. It's just two joints combined into one. When I was in school, I learned to call it the Allen Peters joint. Long story short, Allen Peters was a dominant furniture maker and teacher in the 20th century, one of the few folks with a direct link to the lineage or heritage of the arts and crafts movement due to his work with Edward Barnsley early on in his life. And the first piece that I encountered this in or employed this technique in was one of my earliest pieces when I was in school, a blanket chest, which I've talked about many times on this channel, which is more or less a direct ripoff of Cindy Barnsley, who was one of the founders of the arts and crafts movement and Edward Barnsley's father. So it's all cyclical, it's all incestual to some extent. But what Allen Peters often did was to take these tenons and extend them through the entirety of the piece, creating a through mortise and tenon on the other side. So that's all a housed mortise and tenon is it's a dado with a tenon coming out of it in order to give you more leverage. Now the first question you might have is, that's cool and all, but that seems excessively complicated. Why not just use a bigger dado? Or just do straight mortise and tenons? You guys always ask the best questions. So let's answer the why not just use a deeper dado first. First of all, you absolutely could, and this is very common in contemporary furniture making, where you just take a dado and you shove it in there like half an inch into a 3/4 inch piece of wood, and that provides you with more leverage out here. However, what you're doing is you're substantially weakening this component. Number one, just in general, whether or not this piece is glued in there. But number two, while you're working and you only have a 1/4 inch of material out here and maybe it's a 1/2 inch away from the edge, you've got this flimsy little piece that's just floating in space for ages while you work on this cabinet, and it could be a real issue. Now in plywood, it's less of an issue because that's more structurally stable due to the nature of plywood. But in natural materials, in hardwood, that's a really, really weak point. So it's not ideal to just have a super deep dado in there. Now your second question is, why not just use mortise and tenons and get rid of the dado entirely? What is the dado even doing? Is it adding any structural integrity? Yes and no. It's adding a little bit of glue surface, I admit. But realistically, all it's doing is it's giving you a shoulder to hide any damage to the joint. Say there's a little bit of tear out on here, say there's whatever the situation is, the myriad of things that could happen to this joint. Your shoulder is going to be a nice place to hide any of those damages, any of those human errors. So that is one thing that the shoulder is doing. But also, it's just allowing you more registration to keep this thing nice and square. But, is the dado necessary for this joint? Absolutely not. It's been done a million times in a million different ways with just mortise and tenons and no dado on there. So if that's the variation you want to execute, by all means, I'm not going to judge you for it. Now your last question might be, why not just use one giant tenon instead of multiple tiny tenons? And that's a fair question. Without getting into the history of joinery too much, I have a sneaking suspicion that that stems from its use in something like doors, where you have these bottom rails that are 8, 10, 12 inches wide, and each of those mortise and tenons needs to be able to move to some extent independently due to wood movement seasonally as it meets a component that's not moving in that same orientation. So we're gonna leave that one alone for right now and just say you could do one giant tenon if you wanted to, if the piece wasn't moving so much that that's gonna create structural issues. But that's all I'm gonna say on it for right, because that's a whole other video. So we're just gonna leave that one as it is. Most of the time you're going to do multiple smaller tenons. Also, the whole dado thing that I just touched on before, but I already said that. Now, the last question you might have is, why master this thing? When do I employ it? What's the point of learning this particular joint over, say, glues and screws or dowels? And that's a fair question. We're not going to talk about all of the different variations because at the end of the day, a doweled joint is kind of a variation on this joint, right? But when do you employ this joint? This joint is used for structurally integral components of a case piece. So what I mean by that is, let's take the last big case piece I did, that big bookcase that you can see up on the screen right here. That has
1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7,
8 structurally crucial components. And each one of those is made with a variation on this joint that I cut with a domino. But if you look at it, it's the exact same joint. All this is it's a variation where these are floating tenons rather than integral tenons. That's all it is. But the effect is the same. So that's one example. The blanket chest that I mentioned earlier, those components where the through mortise and tenons are showing on the face, that's a component that locks both faces together that keeps the whole bloody thing stable. Without that joint, the thing might rack in those directions. So that's no bueno. Or, for example, a tool cabinet. So this is a cabinet I made when I was in school. And very briefly, it's a big box, as you can tell, with doors that are also big boxes. These shelves are all floating. They're just sitting on pegs. I could pull them out. But there are 3 structural components to this cabinet that keep it rigid. Number 1, you have your top and bottom piece that are finger jointed on the outside of the case. But then this piece, this center piece right here, is integral to the case and uses that same through mortise and tenon. Same exact thing on the doors. You have a big box. It just happens to have a curve on one face. The corners are finger joints. This particular piece is a through mortise and tenon. So what that does is it locks the thing in place and it's not going to be able to move, and that allows you to have these pieces on top and bottom which are removable, gives you more play, and the thing is still absolutely rigid because of the leverage that that through mortise and tenon is providing, similar to the finger joints on the outside. Also, just to give you some context as to why the dado is so important in this joint as well, you may be able to see from some close-ups underneath here where the dado wasn't used, and you can see the gap because the mortise is ever so slightly larger than the tenon because I was in school and I wasn't that accurate, so that dado hides a multitude of sins. Now, the most common place where I employ this joint is in small cabinets. Think liquor cabinets, single bottle scotch cabinets, that kind of thing. But what this allows me to do, helps if I have this piece right side forward, what it allows me to do is to create this joint that's super, super strong, super stable, very close to the edge, and then I can shape this face and create a beautiful profile, and this thing's gonna last forever. Even if I have a bottle of scotch or a bottle of whiskey on this bottom, and the only thing holding this thing in place is that joint, I'm very confident in how that's going to hold up. So what I wanna do today is show you how to cut this joint. Both variations, the stopped variation that I use on my cabinets and the through variation that I might use in a horizontal application where you see that sidewall to give it some decoration. So, let's dive in. Take a deep breath. I can already hear you clicking away from the video, but hear me out here. Yes, I'm going to use the Shaper Origin in order to cut the first iteration of this joint. And that's for 2 reasons. Number 1, because the honest truth is at this point in time, I would use this machine to cut probably 95% of the joints that I would on this cabinet. It is nothing more than another machine. Just remember, for those who are more inclined to be Luddites, there was a time period where, speaking of Edward Barnsley, earlier at the beginning of this video, where he loathed the integration of the hollow chisel mortiser into his workshop because he thought it was the death of craftsmanship. The hollow chisel mortiser. This is a machine that you don't think twice about using anymore because it still takes skill to set up and execute. That's all I'm going to say on it. Take away from it what you will, agree or disagree as you may, that is yours to do. But it's nothing more than another tool in the workshop. Now, secondly, the reason I'm gonna cut it on this is because the order of operations is exactly the same. First, we're gonna cut the dado, then we're gonna cut the mortise. The only difference on cutting it with this machine versus another method is, with this machine, I'm actually going to cut the tenon first and then cut my mortise second so that I can fit my mortise to my tenon, versus a more traditional way where I would cut my mortise and then fit my tenon to the piece. It's a flip-flopping, but the concept is exactly the same. You're going to fit one to the other to make sure that everything works together harmoniously. So that being said, let's do the stopped version with the origin, and then I will show you how to do the through version analog style. So at this point, what I have cut is essentially a giant tenon. But of course, we're only keeping parts of that giant tenon to actually make the through tenons. So I just realized mid-sentence that I said I was gonna do the stopped one on this one and not the through tenons.
Out of order.
Maybe we do the through tenons on this one. We're gonna cut this up into different sections of the tenons so that they are piercing through at different sections of the mortise. So let's do that. All right, so here is where we're at. We have essentially a giant tenon that's been broken up into 3 parts that is 7/8 of an inch long because the base plate of what would be this cabinet is 7/8 of an inch thick. So that will give us a perfect through tenon on this piece, even though I said we were gonna do a stopped tenon, but I'm sure you can imagine that if we just cut these shorter and made these mortises less deep, then it would be a stopped tenon. The process is exactly the same. But now we have to actually cut the mortise. Again, this is just a tool. Learning how to use it, learning how to integrate it into your workflow is a thing that takes time and practice. But for those of you who do have it, tell you what, man, people making noise out here. Larissa has the kindness to eat quietly behind the camera while this guy is just dragging hoses up. But for those of you who do have the origin, one thing to note is, I don't remember what I was about to say. Let us think for a second. There it is. One thing to note is you can use the same file. I don't have to write up a new file. I just drew that file up on Tool, and I'm gonna take the exact same file, copy it and paste it onto my mortise, and just use that. I'm just gonna change from an outside cut to an inside cut, and the process is exactly the same. So, let's get to doing that. Now, as far as order of operations for cutting the mortise goes, it's going to be the exact opposite of the tenon. So before, I cut the entire depth of my tenon, and then I cut the shoulder of my dado to effectively shorten those tenons. Now we're doing the exact opposite. I'm going to cut the depth of my dado first, which in this case is 1/4 of an inch, and then I'm going to cut each of those mortises at their final depth, which goes all the way down to 7/8 of an inch. So I'm gonna take those in multiple passes. General rule of thumb is don't cut more than, say, 1/4 of an inch. Another rule of thumb that folks have is never more depth than the diameter of the bit, though I tend to not follow that rule very often. I just go with the 1/4 inch rule. So that's what we're gonna do. Let's make some mortises. That's a perfect joint. Now, you can imagine if this is the corner of a case piece, that thing is not going anywhere for generations. That has all the leverage in the world, 7/8 of material to be precise. That thing is gonna be rock solid for many, many hundreds of years. Even if you cut it on the shaper, it's okay, guys, it's okay. Take a deep breath. He's taking a deep breath as well, very clearly. Through Alan Peters' variation, cut in the books, ready to go. How do you cut the stopped version and how do you do it off of the technologically advanced equipment? Let's dive into that. You know, some days you just gotta quit a little early, come back in the next day with a fresh cup of coffee and a treat. And I ain't mad about it. All right, let's see, where did we leave off? Ah, yes, cutting the Alan Peters joint sans computer-aided routers. So how do we go about it? Well, most of the time, you use a router without a computer in it. Now, there's two things I want to say very briefly. Number one, could you cut this joint entirely by hand, meaning no mechanized equipment, no routers, no table saws? Absolutely you could. That's not that hard if I'm honest. I just put out a video about cutting dados by hand, and then all you have to do is cut a mortise and tenon by hand, which is not as complicated as it sounds if you've done it before. It's just a deeper dado. So you can go ahead and do that. But the point of this channel has always been to show you guys the techniques that I use and employ in my projects as a professional furniture maker. And the truth is, and this is my second point, I never really cut things entirely by hand. Even when I'm hand cutting dovetails, I'll usually mechanize some process of it because I just don't have the time. Nor do I have the interest really at this point in time to grind away and with the Sisyphusian task of pushing this boulder uphill all the way when I could make my life a little bit easier by mechanizing some component of the process and making it faster. Because at the end of the day, the thing at the end of the process is the thing that I'm interested, rather than figuring out whether or not I can do it with just sharp steel. Because I've done that already and it doesn't interest me. That in and of itself doesn't interest me. I take enjoyment in it, but it doesn't interest me. So, that being said, we're gonna use this. All right, here's the situation. I've got a dado marked out in pencil and I've got an auxiliary fence that is parallel to that dado, 3 inches away from my center line. And that 3 inches is critical because this base plate that I'm using is 3 inches from the outside of the base plate to the center point of my bit. My bit's a 1/2 inch, the other dado is a 1/2 inch wide, so everything is gonna be nice and consistent. All I need to do now is set my depth to 1/4 inch, which is shallow enough I can do in one pass, and I can walk right up to my pencil line to end my stopped dado and pull out, and I'm gonna have a perfect dado. Then we can reset our depth and we can cut our mortises before we cut our tenons to fit. So let's go ahead and do that. And just like that, our mortise is cut. Now, you can see that working to my pencil line is a very accurate way to do it. I can sneak up on it really easily. If I was cutting a dozen, 2 dozen, 100 of these, I would set up stops so that it's more consistent and I don't have to fit every piece to the other. But if this is a corner joint and case and I'm cutting 4 of them, it's gonna probably take me less time to just shave off the ends of those tenons and fit them to the length of that particular mortise than it is to set up a bunch of stops and make this complicated jig. But that's just me. You may enjoy the jig making process and choose to work differently. Now, one other thing, you may notice that right on here, see if we can get this to focus, there's a little bit of a nick on that side of that wall. Is that the end of the world? No. Is it ideal? Of course not. But this is part of the reason I use that shoulder, is because when I go to put my piece on, it has a 1/8 inch shoulder on either side, and it's gonna cover that up. So no harm, no foul. Now that our mortise is cut and everything looks good and clean and accurate, it's time to cut our tenon to fit our mortise. So let's go over to the router table. All right, so here's what we've got set up at the router table. I've got this big, beefy rabbiting bit that I'm going to use to cut my shoulders. They are 5/8 of an inch deep, so this will do just fine because it's 3/4 of an inch from the outside of the cutter to the center bearing. You can always get a bigger rabbiting bit, or of course you can do this at the table saw as well. I'm just choosing to do it here today. Now, in order to hopefully reduce any chances of blowout on the end of the cut, I'm going to use my marking gauge to slice those fibers and, again, just reduce the chances of blowout. I may still get some. We're gonna find out. We may have to take it easy, but that's what we're gonna do. So all I need to do is set my depth to 1/8 of an inch and then set the distance of my fence to the height of my shoulder, and I can make my passes. All right, with our tenon cut for the top part of our dado, everything is fit, nice and snug as a bug in a rug. Now all we need to do is separate the tenons so that they seat all the way down. So my distances are exactly the same as on the other piece, and they are going to be 3/8 of an inch deep, as you can see it bottoming out here. So very simply, I'm gonna break out my crosscut sled. I'm gonna set that height to 3/8 of an inch. I'm going to mark with a pencil where those pieces fall, and then I'm just gonna cut it. Remove the waste, nice and easy. So let's do that. Now, everything is looking good, everything is feeling good, lines are lining, fits are fitting, it's a beautiful thing. But now, we come to the age-old question. Do you square the mortise or do you round the tenon? Now, I'm not gonna tell you how to work, I'm not gonna make value judgments on your process, but I will say this. It doesn't matter. From a structural perspective, it does not matter. So, from an aesthetic perspective, you have the choice. Do you want a rounded tenon? Do you want it to look more contemporary? Or do you want a square mortise and make it look more traditional? Now, both of those avenues are legitimate, but of course, this is a stopped mortise and tenon, so nobody's ever going to see it. So in reality, it has no bearing whatsoever whether those tenons are rounded or those mortises are squared. And in the name of efficiency, I have found that rounding the tenons tends to be the faster way to go. So that's what we're gonna do. I'm gonna put this in my vise, I'm gonna take a chisel, and I'm not even gonna round them, I'm just gonna angle them so they fit in the bloody mortises, because 99% of the glue surface is still intact, even if it's just missing a little gap around the corner. So let's get this thing fitted to this thing. And just like that, you've got a perfect Allen Peters joint, or a stopped housed mortise and tenon that fits beautifully. Flush up on the front, nice and tight at the shoulders. It's the same process as the digital application, just a few more steps and a couple more machines. That's all it is. But from a strength perspective, you can't go wrong with either one of these joints. Now, briefly on aesthetic applications, because that's no small part of the conversation on this channel. Usually, when I'm making a cabinet and this is attached to the top and the bottom, I do a stopped joint, because there's no real benefit, in my opinion, to putting through joinery on the top and bottom of a thing when very few people are going to see it. So I usually just stop it. Also, these days, not the biggest fan of through joinery, though it does have its place. As far as when to apply the through version, having this be the side of a carcass and you have this nice little detail here, like I did on that bookcase recently, even though that was an accident, but it worked out nicely. That's a really nice application for this, because folks are going to get eyes on it. And that's the whole point of doing through joinery. It is an ornamentation. So that's where I would go with it. You can also do wedged versions of the through joint, which make it look really nice. You can do proud versions of it with a little bit of texture, give it some depth. There's a myriad of applications for it. I encourage you to choose your own path in that regard. But that, friends, as they say, is that. Another one in the books. I hope this was useful and helpful to you, regardless of how you cut it. Hopefully this is a joint that you can integrate into a future project, because it is a bomb-proof joint. It's been around for a long time, and there is a reason that it's been around for a long time. So, now that I have this joint done for my class next week, and I also have that cove cutting jig done for that class as well. If you haven't checked out that video, go check it out. I'll leave a link in the corner above. I am gonna go to actual prototyping this cabinet, so that when I walk into that class, folks can see exactly what we're doing, and we will talk about that probably next week. So, until then, friends, go in the shop, go make a thing, try to enjoy it if you can, and I'll see you then. Cheers. Of course not.
I hope that was captured.
Oh, absolutely. And if you think that's not going in the post-credit audio, for sure.